They say every betrayal begins with a smile. But no one warns you how quiet the world becomes the moment you realize the people you built your life around were only pretending. I remember the sound of laughter before the door shut, the soft echo of glass, the clatter of plates, the warmth I thought was mine. And then his voice, casual, amused, rehearsed. "There's no room for you here." That was the moment something ancient woke up inside me. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud and wasteful. What I felt was older, something colder, sharper, carved from silence itself. You don't fully grasp the machinery of control until you're the one being erased from the table you paid for. Every civilization begins with a promise and ends with a lie. History hides it in palaces, churches, and families. The powerful build systems not to protect truth, but to protect their comfort. Families do it too, only smaller, quieter, disguised as love. They convince you that sacrifice is virtue, that giving more makes you good, that forgiveness is noble, until one day you wake up and realize your kindness has been weaponized against you. That's when the real awakening begins, not in rebellion, but in observation. You start seeing the pattern, the invisible architecture that runs beneath every betrayal, the way institutions, governments, even bloodlines, all operate on the same currency: use, discard, deny. That night, I didn't just lose a seat at a table. I crossed a line that men rarely come back from. The illusion shattered, and what stared back at me was the truth we're never supposed to speak aloud, that loyalty without respect is slavery, and silence in the face of deceit is complicity. The ancients knew this. They warned us in parables, buried it in myths, etched it in stone. But modern men forgot. We traded awareness for approval. We let comfort anesthetize the instinct that once kept our bloodlines alive, the instinct to see betrayal not as tragedy but as revelation. The door closed, but the sound of that lock was not an ending. It was initiation. Every man who's ever been exiled from his own creation must decide, will he crawl back to be accepted, or will he rebuild from the ashes with eyes wide open? Most never choose the latter, but I did. And that choice didn't just change a dinner, it changed everything that came after. The first thing you notice after exile is silence. It's heavier than noise. It hums in the bones, vibrating with all the words you should have said but didn't. For years, I mistook politeness for peace. I believed keeping harmony meant keeping love alive. But silence, when used by others, is a weapon. It lets them write your story without your voice. It lets them paint you as unstable, ungrateful, overreacting, while they sip their wine and smile. And you start to believe them, until one day, that belief cracks and light spills through. That night, I walked the streets alone. Every window glowed with laughter, every home a little theater of belonging. I wondered how many people were out there, standing in the cold like me, banished, forgotten, redefined by those who needed a villain to feel righteous. I realized something vital then. Control doesn't start with power. It starts with narrative. Whoever tells the story shapes the world. My brother-in-law didn't just kick me out of dinner, he rewrote me out of the family's myth, and that I couldn't allow. I began to study them, not as relatives, but as an ecosystem. Every gesture, every glance, every word measured for hierarchy. My sister laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. My mother avoided my eyes when I entered the room. These weren't accidents, they were survival strategies. Families are their own governments, complete with propaganda, scapegoats, and rulers who pretend to serve. Once I saw that, I stopped begging for fairness. Fairness is the illusion used to keep the obedient in line. What matters is leverage, and awareness is the sharpest form of it. Something changed in me. The ache cooled into clarity. I stopped asking why they did it, and started asking what purpose it served. Power, even in its smallest domestic form, is addictive. It needs someone to dominate, someone to silence. And I had played that role perfectly. But not anymore. I was done performing, done apologizing for existing. The next time I walked into that house, I wouldn't be seeking a seat. I would be reclaiming the table. And in that moment of quiet resolve, I understood the oldest truth of all. Sometimes, the only way to survive the empire of manipulation is to become the architect of your own. I didn't build an army. I learned to move like weather, slow, inevitable, rearranging everything without drama. Revenge written in headlines is loud and foolish, the kind that breaks you before it breaks them. What changes tides is small, surgical adjustments. The way you carry yourself, the documents you keep on your desk, the deliberate absence in a room full of noise. The plan began with not more than a notebook, and the steady habit of noticing. I turned observation into architecture. I mapped dates, conversations, transfers, renovations, every tiny breadcrumb that told a larger story. Men who survive betrayal don't explode, they consolidate. They gather evidence as a farmer gathers seed, knowing when to sow and when to wait for the season to ripen. Testing boundaries wasn't a confrontation, it was a litmus test. I called once, polite, measured as if nothing had happened, heard the click of avoidance on the other end. I sent a text with a photo of the loan document, then waited to see which phones buzzed and which ones pretended not to. Those who answer immediately are usually acting from habit, those who delay are acting from strategy. I observed how presence was traded like currency at their table. Late dinners became a display of who belonged and who didn't. So I stopped showing up to events that required permission. I stopped offering explanations. Power repels beg. Jing, it is drawn to integrity and to the refusal to plead. Private moves mattered more than public spectacle. I rebuilt my life in plain sight, paying attention to retirement accounts, consulting a lawyer quietly, requesting appraisals and credit histories under lawful means. Each mundane act, the scheduling of an appraisal, the certified letter I prepared, was a nail driven into the argument that I was merely an old man clinging to sentiment. They framed me as sentiment. I reframed the world as fact. Facts are heavy. Facts don't care about guilt or forgiveness. When you place facts on a table, they change the conversation by themselves. But perhaps the most effective weapon was the change in posture. Men who are accustomed to being shuffled to the periphery carry the slump of expectation in their shoulders. I straightened mine. I spoke less. When I spoke, people leaned in because my voice had weight. Silence became a signal, not surrender. I stopped apologizing for existing, I learned. 2. Ask only the questions that advanced my position. And when I did engage, on the phone, at a meeting, in a voicemail, my words were measured, legal, unemotional. The people who relied on chaos to hide their deeds were suddenly exposed to methodical calm. It's astonishing what a composed man can do in a room full of theatrics. They began to trip over their own stories because mine no longer bent to meet theirs. Without a raised fist, without a public spectacle, the power spreadsheet shifted, line by line, ledger by ledger, until the balance no longer favored those who had laughed at my pie on the doorstep. The turning point didn't arrive with thunder, it came with paperwork. One quiet afternoon, a single envelope marked "Notice of Transfer" appeared in my mailbox. To anyone else it would have looked like routine correspondence, but I knew the weight of it. It meant the property, the house that had hosted every Thanksgiving for 20 years, was now legally under my review. A technical CLA. Use my late father had written decades ago, buried in the will, had matured. Control of the estate's joint assets passed temporarily to the senior family member of record. That happened to be me. The timing wasn't poetic, it was procedural. But poetry lives in the awareness of procedure. I smiled for the first time in months. I didn't rush to announce anything. Real authority doesn't speak first. I visited the house quietly, clipboard in hand, and noted repairs that had been ignored, taxes that had been delayed, utilities still in my name. Each neglected detail became a strand in the net. When I finally called my sister, I spoke like an accountant, not a brother. "We'll need to update the property files. Compliance deadlines are approaching." She heard it in my tone. The shift from apology to protocol. Emotion is negotiable, regulation is not. That single call rewrote our dynamic more effectively than any argument ever could. Soon, messages arrived, questions masked as concern, invitat, ions disguised as negotiation. "Maybe we should all sit down," my brother-in-law suggested. I agreed, but on neutral ground. A cafe, not the house. When he walked in, his confidence flickered. I had no anger left to feed his performance. I carried a folder instead of a grievance. I let him talk, let him fill the air with justifications, and when he paused for validation, I slid a document across the table, copies of invoices, unpaid balances, photos of maintenance issues. His smile faltered. I didn't need to raise my voice. Numbers did the talking. That meeting wasn't revenge, it was recalibration. The moment he realized I had stopped reacting, the hierarchy collapsed. People who manipulate depend on your emotional participation. Withdraw it, and their scaffolding falls apart. He left that cafe with polite words, but a different posture, smaller, unsure. The following day he sent a message, "Let's figure this out together." I didn't reply immediately. Power grows in pauses. By the end, F the week, the invitations reversed. The very man who once declared, "There's no room for you," now asked, "Can we meet at your place?" The circle had closed, not through rage or spectacle, but through precision. The lesson was simple, ancient, and quietly victorious. When you own your silence, you own the room. Control, once regained, tests the soul more than loss ever did. Power has a flavor that tempts a man to drink too deeply, to turn victory into vanity. I felt it tug at me as the days grew quieter. The phone calls came softened now, voices dipped in politeness, but I could hear the unease beneath each syllable. They wanted peace, but peace defined on their terms. The old reflex rose in me, the urge to forgive too soon, to trade clarity for comfort. That's how cycles restart. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe before speaking, to let truth settle before compassion returned. In the calm that followed, I began to see legacy differently. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about ensuring no one after me learned submission as their first language. Families hand down more than property, they hand down posture. If I caved now, I'd be teaching my nephews that boundaries are optional, that kindness means yielding to manipulation. So, I started to build something cleaner. I met with an advisor, drafted a foundation clause, scholarships for those in the family who showed initiative, grants for those who served others. No signatures required from the ones who mocked me. The empire they tried to monopolize would outlive them, but under a new design, transparent, accountable, impossible to twist. When we met again, I spoke gently. "This isn't punishment," I told them. "It's structure, so no one else has to go through what we did." They nodded, unsure if it was mercy or strategy. In truth, it was both. Mercy without structure becomes exploitation. Structure without mercy becomes tyranny. The balance was the lesson. That evening, as I walked past the dining room window, I saw them seated again. Smaller gathering, fewer decorations, but laughter genuine this time. They didn't notice me pause at the gate. I didn't need an invitation anymore. The table wasn't my prison. It had become my proof. I turned away, the winter air crisp against my face, and felt a quiet resolve settle inside me. The door they'd closed had led me here, to ownership not of a house, but of myself. In the end, revenge had evolved into something cleaner, reclamation. Power, when tempered by understanding, becomes stewardship. And that, perhaps, is the only legacy worth leaving. Freedom is quieter than I imagined. It doesn't arrive with applause or vindication. It comes disguised as routine, the hum of a kettle in the morning, the stillness of a house that finally feels like yours. At first, I mistook the calm for emptiness. After years of defense, of measuring every word and glance, silence felt suspicious. But slowly I began to recognize it as peace, the kind you don't need to explain or protect. Freedom, I learned, isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of permission. Days turned into weeks, and my world rearranged itself. I no longer built my schedule around other people's expectations. I worked when I wanted, rested when I needed, spoke only when it added value. The noise that used to fill every corner of my mind, the what-ifs, the guilt, the rehearsed apologies, faded. I realized how much of my life had been spent auditioning for belonging. When you stop performing, you start living. One morning I received a letter from my sister, short, handwritten, careful. "You were right," it began. "I didn't see what was happening until it was too late. I hope it's not too late now." I read it twice, then set it down. I didn't feel triumph, only understanding. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't something you offer for their sake. It's a way to unshackle yourself from the echo of the past. I wrote back, not with warmth or distance, but with Bala. "It's not too late, but things must stay different." I started spending time with people who spoke without strategy. Neighbors, old friends, even strangers at the cafe. Conversations not laced with performance felt like air after a long confinement. I learned to listen again, not for subtext, but for humanity. Freedom, it turns out, doesn't come from isolation. It comes from clarity, knowing who to let close and who to let pass by without anger. By spring, the old house stood quieter too. Repairs completed, papers filed, debts cleared. It was no longer a battlefield, just a structure made of memories. Sometimes I'd walk through it alone, touching the walls, the corners where laughter once lived. The house hadn't betrayed me. People had. And even they were no longer enemies, just chapters. You can't rewrite history, but you can outgrow it. That evening, as dusk settled over the porch, I sat with a cup of tea and realized something rare. Revenge had fulfilled its purpose. The M. meant it stopped being revenge. What began as a reckoning had turned into restoration, and in that stillness I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not relief, but peace with power. Wisdom doesn't announce itself. It settles slowly, like dust after a storm. It arrives when the shouting stops, when you've run out of justifications and the only thing left is understanding. I used to think betrayal destroyed people. Now I see it refines them. Fire doesn't only burn, it clarifies. It strips the gold from the alloy, reveals what can't be faked. In losing everything I thought I needed, I found what was actually mine: discernment. The ability to see clearly without resentment is rarer than any inheritance. When people ask me now how to handle injustice, I tell them this: never let someone else's cruelty turn you cruel. Revenge that feeds on hatred eats you first. If you must strike back, do it through clarity. Let truth be the weapon and integrity the blade. Learn how systems, familial, social, even personal, replicate themselves through silence and guilt. The moment you stop feeding those cycles, they begin to die. You don't have to destroy others, you only have to stop participating in your own diminishment. I began teaching this lesson in small ways. A friend going through divorce, a neighbor dealing with manipulation at work. They'd come for advice, expecting bitterness. Instead, I spoke of posture, of presence. I told them how power often hides in patience, how listening without absorbing is a skill worth mastering. The ones who wronged you will expect noise, protest, spectacle. Give them stillness instead. Stillness disorients tyrants. They thrive on your reaction, deny it, and you expose their dependency. There were days when old anger tried to resurface. I didn't fight it, I let it speak, then let it go. Healing isn't about erasing memory, it's about changing its purpose. Each memory that once hurt became instruction, each scar a map of where not to return. I learned to thank the pain without worshiping it. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the window. The lines on my face had deepened, but my eyes looked alive again, focused, unflinching. The man staring back wasn't the outcast anymore, he was the architect, not of revenge, but of renewal. The door they'd closed had opened to a different kind of inheritance, one made not of property or pride, but of peace earned the hard way. So now, when I tell the story, I don't end it with the dinner, or the laughter, or even the lock turning in the door. I end it here, with stillness, awareness, and a truth whispered for anyone listening. They can take your seat, but never your sovereignty. Mentorship found me by accident. It began with a knock one evening, hesitant, almost embarrassed. The young man at my door was a distant relative, someone I hadn't seen since childhood dinners blurred with laughter and tension. His voice shook when he spoke. "They're turning everyone against me, I don't know what I did wrong." His eyes held that familiar confusion, the one I once wore like a second skin. I saw myself in him, the same mixture of disbelief and despair that comes when the ground beneath your family shifts. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat by the fire, 2 generations divided by years but united by the same lesson waiting to be learned. I didn't comfort him with cliches, I told him the truth. You're not losing them, you're losing the version of them that benefited from your silence. He stared at the flames as if trying to decode them. "But what do I do?" he asked. "Do nothing for now," I said. "Observe. People will always reveal themselves if you stop defending them." It's the hardest advice to follow, to stay still when your instincts scream for action, but that's where strength is forged. In the weeks that followed, he returned often, sometimes with updates, sometimes just to sit in the quiet. I watched him change, the defensiveness fading, replaced by focus. One night he brought a small notebook, pages filled with patterns he'd noticed, who interrupted whom, who withheld information, who used guilt as leverage. He was mapping his own battlefield the way I once had. "I see it now," he said softly. "It's not about me, it's about control." I nodded. "Exactly. Once you understand the game, you stop being a piece on their board." Guiding him reminded me of my own transformation, and I realized something deeper. Wisdom only solidifies when it's shared. Knowledge kept in isolation rots into pride. But when you pass it on, it becomes lineage. I wasn't teaching revenge, I was teaching restoration, the art of reclaiming yourself without replicating your oppressor. Months later, he came back with a calm I recognized. "They stopped trying to blame me," he said. "It's like they don't know what to do anymore." I smiled. "That's because you stopped feeding their power." He looked relieved, lighter somehow. As he left that night, I felt an old cycle breaking, not just for me, but for him. and maybe for everyone who'd ever been told there was no room for them at a table they helped build. In that moment, I understood legacy not as inheritance, but as continuation. We pass down more than wealth, we pass down awareness. And awareness, once awakened, doesn't end with us. Healing never moves in straight lines, it ripples. What begins in one person's quiet decision not to repeat the past spreads outward in ways you don't expect. I noticed it first in the small things. My sister, who once avoided every difficult truth, started calling without pretense. No hidden agendas, no side conversations. The tone of her voice had changed. The younger ones spoke more freely around her. It was as if one act of boundary setting had tuned the whole family to a new frequency. I didn't take credit. Healing doesn't belong to anyone. But I began to understand that dignity behaves like gravity. When you claim your own, others begin to find their bala. The young man I'd mentored brought a friend to visit, another soul tangled in the same knots of guilt and confusion. I listened to her story, and for the first time, I didn't feel the old anger rise. I felt purpose. We sat on the porch as dusk settled, and I told her what I had learned the hard way. The moment you stop asking for fairness from those who thrive on imbalance, you become free. She nodded slowly, eyes shining with the relief of recognition. Each conversation became a kind of quiet rebellion against the systems we inherit, those invisible contracts written in shame, obligation, and fear. Every time someone chose clarity over compliance, the air around us got lighter. There was no grand ceremony, no declaration of reconciliation, just people learning slowly to stand upright again. The family that once operated like a closed circuit began to open. Old grudges lost their script because no one was rehearsing them anymore. Even gatherings changed. The next Thanksgiving, I received an invitation. This time it came without expectation. I went, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. The laughter was softer, the table smaller, but the energy was different. My brother-in-law greeted me with the careful humility of someone who's been watching his own reflection for a while. We didn't speak of the past, we didn't need to. The absence of manipulation was its own apology. As I looked around that evening, I realized the revenge had completed its final transformation. It had become redemption. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that rewrites its meaning. The same house that once symbolized exclusion now stood as proof that cycles could break if even one person decided to see clearly and act accordingly. When I left, I paused at the door, the same door that had once closed in my face. This time it stayed open behind me, warm light spilling into the cold night. I understood then that true victory isn't about who gets to stay or who leaves. It's about ensuring no one else has to fight for their place at the table ever again. There's a point in every journey where the story stops being personal and becomes something larger, an echo that belongs to everyone who's ever been silenced, shamed, or cast aside. Sitting on my porch in the pale light of morning, I began to understand that what had happened to me wasn't unique at all. It was simply the human pattern repeating itself, control masquerading as care, belonging traded for obedience, love used as leverage. Every generation has to confront it anew. My version just happened to play out over a dining table and a locked door. I used to think of awareness as an awakening, a single moment when you suddenly see everything. Now I know it's slower, quieter. Awareness is maintenance. It's the daily act of keeping your eyes open when comfort begs you to close them. It's choosing truth over approval, clarity over nostalgia. When you hold on to that discipline, you stop asking life to be fair and start making it honest. I saw the same principle mirrored everywhere, in workplaces, in friendships, in nations, people trying to preserve peace by pretending not to notice the imbalance that sustained it. The mechanism was always the same, the few taking more space than they earned, the many apologizing for taking any at all, and I realized my small rebellion at a family table was part of something older and wider, a human effort to remember that dignity isn't granted by others, it's generated from within. The house, the letters, the reconciliations, those were surface stories. The deeper narrative was the reclamation of voice. Each person who learns to speak without asking permission contributes to a quieter revolution. There are no slogans, no flags, just people becoming whole again, refusing to play roles written by fear. Sometimes I wonder what my younger self would think if he could see me now, sitting here with no need to prove, no hunger for revenge. He'd probably ask how I managed to forgive. I'd tell him the truth. Forgiveness wasn't a choice. It was the natural consequence of seeing clearly. Once you understand why people act as they do, bitterness loses its grip. What remains is perspective, a steady, earned peace that doesn't depend on anyone's approval. I leaned back, watching the horizon brighten. The world was still flawed, still loud, still learning. But for the first time, I felt aligned with it instead of at war with it. The struggle for dignity, I realized, doesn't end. It simply changes hands, passing from one generation to the next. I made confession. I thought I was the only one. Each of them had been told in some way that their space had run out, that their presence, their questions, their worth no longer fit inside the narrow boundaries others drew for them, and each of them had obeyed for a while, just as I once did. I didn't give them comfort. Comfort is the language of captivity. I gave them truth, the kind that doesn't soothe but strengthens. I told them that betrayal is not the end of loyalty, only its test. That being exiled from someone else's table is not punishment, it's liberation. That when the door closes, it's not rejection, it's revelation. Because what locks you out is often what was poisoning you all along. Some called me a mentor, others called me bitter. But I knew the difference. Bitterness chains itself to the past, clarity cuts it loose. I wasn't teaching revenge, I was teaching reclamation, how to reclaim one's power without losing one's humanity. The secret isn't in striking back, it's in ending taller, seeing farther, and walking away with your silence sharpened into presence. I began to see a pattern in their stories. Every one of them had been taught some version of the same lie, that survival depends on obedience, that power is something others grant. But power, real power, is self-possession, the unshakable calm that comes when you know exactly who you are and refuse to be negotiated down. Institutions, families, governments, they all thrive on the same trick, keeping you unsure of your worth, so you'll trade it for belonging. In the beginning, I thought this was just about one dinner, one house, one betrayal. But as I listened to these people, I understood this is humanity's oldest wound, the theft of agency, the silencing of truth. And maybe that's why it hurts so deeply, because every time one person is told there's no room, it echoes 1,000 years of hierarchy, fear, and control. I told them the same thing I'll tell you now when the world says there's no space for you. Don't beg for a seat. Build your own table and make it indestructible. It started quietly, an article here, a podcast mentioned there. My words, once spoken to a handful of broken strangers, began to drift beyond my reach. Someone clipped a quote, someone misquoted a sentence, and before long, the story of what happened at that dinner was no longer mine. They called me a self-help prophet, a rebel, a cynic, even a threat. Some said I was teaching defiance, others said I was poisoning families. I didn't answer any of them. You can't debate with an echo. The truth was simpler than the noise. I wasn't preaching rebellion, I was describing self-possession. But the world has never been kind to that idea. Systems, whether built of laws, faith, or family expectation, survive by keeping people unsure of where they end and where authority begins. When someone learns to draw their own line, it unsettles everything. So the resistance wasn't personal, it was predictable. Invitations came me from talk shows and conferences. They wanted spectacle, not understanding. Tell us how to stand up to our in-laws, they said. Tell us the secret to never being hurt again. I smiled, declined, and kept to my small gatherings. Because there is no secret, only attention, and attention can't be sold, only practiced. Still, I could feel the current shifting. Some of those who once came to learn now came to challenge. You make it sound easy, they said. You talk about boundaries as if they fix everything. I listened and then told them the hardest truth. Boundaries don't fix things, they expose them. They show you who values you and who only valued their access to you. That's why most people avoid them. At night, I'd walk through the quiet streets, watching the lights in other houses. Inside, people were playing the same old roles, keeping peace through silence, mistaking exhaustion for love. And I realized the resistance wasn't a wall to break, it was a mirror. It showed me how apply the world fears self-awareness because awareness dismantles every borrowed certainty. So I stopped arguing and started listening again. Every criticism, every distortion, it all revealed how hungry people were for a language that could describe their quiet rebellion. I gave them that language word by word, knowing full well that power always trembles when people begin to name what's real. It happened on a winter evening, under the pale lights of a crowded community hall. I had been invited to speak, not by supporters this time, but by skeptics. They said they wanted a conversation, but I could feel the sharpness behind the smiles. Rows of chairs faced a narrow stage, or questions came fast. accusations disguised as inquiries. Aren't you just teaching people to be selfish? Isn't cutting off family the easy way out? Who are you to decide what's right? Each sentence hit like a test. I could feel the old reflex rising, the need to defend, to justify, to explain. But I had learned that truth doesn't argue, it simply remains. So I took a breath and answered, not to win, but to remind. No, I said, I'm teaching people to be whole. Selfishness takes more than it gives. Wholeness gives more than it needs. And boundaries aren't walls, they're mirrors. They show us what love can and cannot carry. A few faces softened, most stayed hard. That was fine. Growth is never unanimous. One man in the crowd stood up, angry. You tore families apart, he shouted. People stopped talking to their parents because of you. His voice shook, not with rage, but with grief. I looked at him and saw the wound behind the words. No, I said gently. The silence was Al. Ready there. They just stopped pretending it was love. The hall went still. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. I didn't raise my voice, didn't meet hostility with fire. I simply let the quiet do what truth does best, echo. When it was over, I stepped outside. Snow had begun to fall, soft and unhurried. My breath fogged in the air as I thought of that man and all the others like him, those trapped between loyalty and self-respect. Change always feels like betrayal to those who benefit from things staying the same. That night, I realized resistance wasn't my enemy, it was proof of impact. You don't face that kind of fury unless you've touched something real. After that night, something in me settled, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. The confrontation hadn't been about right or wrong, it was about readiness. People resist what they're not yet ready to face, and every word I'd spoken had pressed against a door some weren't prepared to open. I couldn't force them through. See, harm doesn't happen by dragging others into the light. It happens by keeping the light steady until they choose to see. For days I replayed the man's face in my mind, the anger, the grief. I realized he wasn't my opponent, he was my reflection, a mirror of who I once was when truth first scraped against denial. His pain was the same pain I had felt when I was told I didn't belong, when I mistook rejection for loss instead of release. We were both learning, just at different speeds. I walked through the city that week, unnoticed, watching the rhythm of ordinary life, people rushing to be seen, heard, accepted, trading authenticity for approval without realizing the cost. It struck me how fragile belonging becomes when it depends on agreement. Real belonging, I thought, is not about being accepted everywhere. It's about being at peace anywhere. That realization marked the shift from message to legacy. I stopped thinking about audiences and started thinking about inheritance, not the kin. Measured in wealth, but in awareness. What if each conversation, each act of courage, planted a seed in someone else? What if the next generation didn't have to unlearn silence before learning truth? That would be enough. So I began to write, not speeches, not lessons, but letters. Private, quiet letters to those who had written me before. I told them to keep teaching, to keep building their own tables, to remember that transformation isn't loud, it's consistent. A single honest act repeated is more powerful than 1,000 speeches, and slowly, I understood something I hadn't before. Revolutions built on anger burn out, but revolutions built on integrity endure. Because integrity doesn't need recognition, it just needs continuity. As winter deepened, I sat again on that same porch where everything had started. The air was cold but clear, and I thought of all the people out there learning to claim their own space. They didn't need my protection anymore. They had become their own pro. I smiled. The story that began with being pushed out of a room had become the blueprint for creating countless new ones. Morning light draped across the porch like a benediction. The years had worn smooth the sharp edges of everything that once defined me. Anger, pride, vindication. What remained was clarity. I understood now that every exile, every silence, every misunderstanding had been a teacher dressed in disguise. They had all conspired not to break me, but to deliver me to this stillness. Freedom, I realized, isn't the absence of constraint, it's the mastery of presence. It's the quiet assurance that no one, not family, not fate, not fear, can dictate the terms of your worth. It's sitting at your own table, unbothered by who refuses to join, and at peace with who chooses to stay. When people used to ask me what I learned from being cast out of that Thanksgiving dinner, I struggled to answer. But now I can say this: what they meant as rejection became initiation. What they see, old selfishness, was selfhood in bloom. And what they thought was the end of family was simply the end of illusion. I watched the horizon soften, the sky bruised with color, and I thought of every person who had once written to me, those still searching for their voice, those still waiting for permission to stand. I wished I could tell them one thing: you don't need anyone to make room for you. You are the room. The moment you understand that, you stop living as a guest in your own life. Inside the house, the kettle whistled faintly. The smell of tea filled the air, simple, grounding, human. I took it as a reminder that life doesn't reward the loud or the righteous. It rewards the consistent, the sincere. Power isn't in dominance, it's in direction. And peace, real peace, is the quiet that comes when you no longer need to prove anything. I raised my cup toward the empty chair across from me. Once that emptiness would have hurt. Now it felt sacred. Space, after all, is not absence. Invitation. An opening for what's next, for whoever will arrive honest enough to sit in truth. The wind moved through the trees, gentle but certain, carrying away the last echoes of that night long ago. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle around me. Not an ending, not even a victory, just completion. The kind that doesn't need applause. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I'd been pushed out of anything. I had simply stepped into myself.